Okay, I think I will start. I can see that there's still some people coming in, but I will start because we only have 1 hour. So I want to get started as soon as possible so that we have more time for discussion. So Vatania, can you please pass on to the next slide, or Veronica, sorry. So welcome everyone to this webinar on nature-based solutions beyond do no harm, how we can do better with nature in the humanitarian sector. This webinar is hosted by the Environment and Humanitarian Action Network, as well as the Friends of Ecosystem-Based Adaptation Group and the Partnership for Environment and Disaster Risk Reduction, or PEDR network. So we're very pleased to have this first cross-network working group webinar. Today, we will start off with an introduction on nature-based solutions, what that means. We will then have something that we call a speed round, where we're reaching out to participants. We will then hear from cases in the field. What are nature-based solutions? How are they being used in humanitarian settings in practice? And then we end up with a discussion and a closing. I realize I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Emilia Walseman. I work with the UNEP OCHA Joint Environment Unit, and I represent the Environment and Humanitarian Action Network here today. Just a couple of housekeeping rules, if I could go back one. So please use the Q&A. If you're familiar with Zoom, we have the Q&A function, so you can ask questions to the speakers during the presentations. Please indicate your name and organizations as you ask your questions. During this speed round that we have, but also later on in the discussion, if you can please raise your hand if you want to speak, and then our host can unmute you. The meeting will also be recorded so that we can share it with others who are unable to join in person. You can also use the chat function if you have any questions or technical difficulties as we go along. Next slide, please. So first, just a short introduction on why and how we started thinking about this webinar. Well, what we see today, of course, is that nature is getting more prominence in the discussion on our society and the problems that we are facing. Whereas before we were thinking maybe more only about climate change. What we do understand is that nature is, of course, equally as climate change, also very closely linked to root causes of conflict, famine, and pandemics. And that's why in humanitarian settings, it makes sense to address nature when we conduct our humanitarian activities. For us, it's very much it's a climate social justice issue as well, and an equity issue, because we see that those that are most affected and often most reliant on humanitarian aid are also those that have a smaller or even a negative environmental footprint. And they are also, unfortunately, the ones that are most dependent on environment for survival and thriving. We have seen lately quite a bit of guidance coming out, trying to link disaster risk reduction and resilience into humanitarian context and humanitarian programming. And that is, of course, great. However, we still feel that the nature agenda is missing from some of these initiatives. And this is also why we very much welcome the increased focus now on nature and the increased prominence that nature-based solutions are getting in humanitarian context. This is also why we wanted to organize this webinar. So with that, I will then hand over to Veronica Ruiz, who is the Nature-Based Solutions Program Officer at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, who will present a little bit on nature-based solutions and explain some of the concepts before we go on. Thank you.
Thank you, Emilia, for the introduction. So for the next 5 minutes, I will try to drive you through a bit of short introduction about nature-based solutions. That is mainly a term that you have heard so far. So forest landscape restoration, green infrastructure, ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. There are so many different terms, different approaches, and all of them are part of the same family, the nature-based solutions umbrella concepts. For all the noise that we are making, such an incredible, as they sound, what really are nature-based solutions? You may hear back and forth like in meetings like, yes, NBS, nature climate solutions, but what are nature-based solutions? So according to the IUCN definitions, these are actions to protect, sustainable manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively. But what is different now? Are we, the conservationists, changing the way of working? No, what is different now is a different approach, the NBS approach, that addresses societal challenges, simultaneously providing human well-being and diversity benefits. Nature-based solutions is kind of shifting the conservation paradigm to establish a second pillar. They are actions that, of course, safeguard nature, biodiversity, flora and fauna, while providing tangible societal needs to address the specified challenges. But in doing so, extending the reach and relevance of conservation to human well-being more systematically, based on evidence, real evidence, what is what we need. And also, we contribute towards achieving the 7 societal challenges that I mentioned. These are the ones you can see in the slide. We have food and water security, social and economic development, health, which is very in line with the pandemic that we are living and facing, environmental degradation, loss of biodiversity, climate change, and disaster risk reduction. Disaster, climate change, migration, displacement. Environmental and humanitarian action is often understood as 2 different sectors, not working together. However, the lack of awareness regarding these intersections could trigger long-term devastation. With a growing number of crises, we are hitting flooding in Philippines, typhoon, the Eta hurricane. With this growing number of crises around the world, humanitarian actors are essential, and they have to work together with conservationists and with environmental actors. They are often the first responders. They have to work in emergency periods, during and after a crisis, providing vital life-saving assistance, which is critical. However, there is an increasing need for such actors to pay attention to long-term implications of their operations, particularly with regard to the environment, but this is why we are discussing today. Also, environmental degradation is causing humanitarian crises, and humanitarian crises are exacerbating areas that were already or are already in a lot of strain. We have to think also that both sectors will work sort of in a different time frames. Humanitarians tend to work to address immediate crises, while conservationists, we tend to imagine 5, 7, 10 years programs. We all often speak a different language. But now, to address this language problem, we have a new tool that can help us in building a common understanding. This is a powerful tool, a powerful and incredible pathway for transitioning to sustainable development. And this powerful tool is the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions. This is a tool that, as I said, is building up a common language that we can all talk the same, so we can all have the same understanding. It builds, this standard is not building up in starting from scratch. This standard builds on decades of robust conservation work and is strongly grounded in ecosystem-based approaches. Ecosystem-based approaches that are embedded within the concept of nature-based solutions. This is the first ever facilitative approach, and we have been working together with experts across different sectors. not only conservationists, but conservationists listening to what are the needs there outside our sector and working all together to come up with a tool that can help in design, verify, and scale up nature-based solutions. So this tool can help us together to respond to so many questions that we have been asking for the last time. How can we scale up nature-based solutions? How can we mainstream nature-based solutions into policy? How can we build the case? Always talking about building the case and developing bankable opportunities. Or how can we learn more? Or how can we gather evidence? And especially, this is one of the questions that we are both sectors talking about. How can we mainstream these concepts without a common understanding between ourselves? How can we do that? Now with this tool, we can start building this common understanding and work together towards bringing a green legacy to the world, to the society. So by saying this, I can just say, like, how can we scale up when there is no work to ensure that it's not just another tool or another way for nature and people to be exploited? How can we scale up and how can avoid this? This we can do in both sectors together through nature-based solutions. So Emilia,
thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Veronica, for that introduction. And now I'll hand over to Charlotte Hicks, who is also co-organizing this webinar together with us. She's a senior technical officer with the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center, and she will present some information on how nature-based solutions are being used currently with a focus on adaptation to climate change. Charlotte, over to you.
Thank you. So thank you, Emilia. Thank you, Veronica. So what we'd like to do now is look in a little bit more detail about how nature-based solutions are being used and what we can say about their effectiveness, with a focus on NBS for climate change adaptation. Next slide. Okay, so we already know that NBS are increasingly in use across a range of different sectors, ecosystems and context, and they're being used to address a wide range of different hazards and challenges, such as those mentioned by Veronica. And this can be for climate change adaptation, for disaster risk reduction, for health and so on. We also know that NBS are often modified and adapted to suit different circumstances, and that they can be used together with other approaches, such as infrastructure, community-based approaches, early warning systems, and so on. And we also know that there's a growing evidence base on the effectiveness of NBS, and this is about their core impact, whether or not they're achieving what they're set out to do, as well as their capacity to deliver co-benefits, so additional benefits for economy, society, and for the environment. Next slide. So there's a little bit of a delay, but I won't go into a lot of detail here. This slide provides some examples of the different types of hazards and the different types of NBS that can be used to address them, looking at different ecosystems such as mountains, forests, rivers, and areas such as farmland, cities, and coasts. I'll just highlight a couple here. At the top, you can see forest management to reduce the risk of intense or extreme wildfires, or under farmland, protecting and restoring forests to slow water runoff, and under coasts, restoring coastal wetlands together with engineered measures to address the impacts from rising sea levels and coastal erosion. Next slide. So when it comes to NBS for adaptation, you would have also heard of the term ecosystem-based adaptation. The information here comes from a review that was conducted with the Global Commission on Adaptation last year, which was looking at what has been the uptake of different types of MBS across some different sectors, such as food security and rural livelihoods, cities, infrastructure, and industry and supply chains. And this review looked at more than 100 different cases of EBA interventions, and it found that the majority of these were taking place in the food security and rural livelihood sectors, and they were looking at addressing hazards related to intense precipitation and drought. There's also considerable experience and use of MBS in addressing coastal hazards, such as sea level rise, storm surges, and erosion, especially in terms of risk to infrastructure. Next slide. So we also are interested in the question of how effective MBS are for climate change adaptation. And this is an area where there are a growing number of studies and increasing emphasis on M&E. To give you an example here, this comes from a systematic review of more than 370 different studies, cases, and models, looking at the effectiveness of nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation. This review found that 59% of the interventions are judged to reduce climate change impacts. Most were considered as effective or more effective than alternatives, such as infrastructure. They were more likely to deliver synergies or co-benefits rather than trade-offs in terms of broader social and environmental outcomes. But also that gaps remain in the evidence base. So there's significant bias in terms of evidence in the global north compared to other parts of the world, and gaps like fewer studies on cost effectiveness or cost benefit analysis. I'm not sure how well the infographic is showing, but it's basically telling us that a lot of these studies and cases were looking at created ecosystems, such as man-made forests or planted forests, and restoration of ecosystems. And most of them were tackling things like reduced water availability and soil erosion. Next slide. So this was a quick overview, but I think we can see that the use of MBS is expanding across different sectors, across different contexts and ecosystems, but it hasn't reached its full potential yet. When we talk to people about why that is, some of the reasons that we often hear are entrenched attitudes or norms that may favor certain approaches over MBS, sectoral silos that may discourage people from working together, policy and regulatory environments or procedures that are unfavorable to MBS. People often cite technical challenges or a lack of capacity on MBS. There's also issues around access to finance and competition for scarce resources. And finally, that MBS are often looking at long-term or incremental change. Okay, next slide. So we've now come to what we're calling a speed round. And the goal here is to get a really quick picture from you, from the participants, about how much MBS might be used and what are some of your perceptions about barriers. And we're looking for some volunteers from the participants, people who would like to try and answer these 3 questions in 60 seconds or less. So the 3 questions are: 1, after hearing about MBS, is your organization currently using them? And perhaps you call them something different, but they may still be MBS. Secondly, do you feel like you are ready to start using MBS or to use them more? If not, what's stopping you? What do you think are the top 1 or 2 barriers that may be preventing uptake of MBS in your organization? So we're asking for volunteers. If you would like to give this a go, please raise your hand using the hand raising function. And we'll see if we can answer these 3 questions in 60 seconds or less.
I think I have one from Ingrid.
Okay.
Go ahead, over to you, please.
Okay, Ingrid, would you like to give this a go?
Yes. So I'm actually working for a Swedish municipality, so I'm not exactly in the humanitarian action, but we work with drinking water and wastewater treatment, and we are using nature-based solutions. So yes, what is stopping us to use them more? That would be regulations. Sometimes it's difficult to follow up the results and effectiveness. So I guess legal reasons. And I guess that's the same. What is stopping us? That would be difficulties to follow up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Excellent job. That was 40 seconds. Do we have any other volunteers who would like to give this a go? You can also tap it in. You can also type your responses into the chat if you would like to try that as well. So
I see we have one more. No, we have two more. I'll call on Ingrid Guerrero to begin with, and maybe Tanya can unmute.
Yeah, sure. Jamie, over to you, please.
Yeah, I'm Jamie. I'm from Catholic Relief Services, and our organisation, or the department I'm involved with, is with Humanitarian Response. In terms of using these, no, I don't think so, not yet, but we are kind of interested. I think that we're seeing some cross-cutting with our development actors, in especially around agriculture and other areas. Do we feel we're ready to start? I think there's kind of emerging agenda where we're getting more interested, so I don't know if we're ready. I think we have the capacity, but we need to shift the way that we work and look at things a little bit. We are much more kind of interested in the environment, but in terms of actually taking on this focus is difficult. So what is stopping us? We're a big vessel. We can't change direction. We don't have the agility to change direction so quickly. I think we will, but it's just going to take time. Okay, thank you.
okay, thank you, Jamie. 54 seconds. Very good. And I think we have one more person.
Yes.
Ingrid as well.
Ingrid, over to you, please.
I see that she does not have her hand raised anymore, so I suggest
So we
maybe
may have lost Ingrid.
We may have lost her, but we can catch up with her in the chat and maybe move on now.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for those two inputs. It's interesting to hear about the different perceptions and perspectives on this. What we'd like to do now is move on to our case studies. So we're going to have 3 case studies looking at how MBS are being used on the ground in humanitarian contexts. And I'd like to introduce the first one. Our speaker is Mr. Rakib Amin, Bangladesh Country Representative for IUCN. Rakib, over to you.
Thank you. If you can move the slides. Okay, good evening, everybody. It's evening in Dhaka. If you don't know where Bangladesh is, this is the map for you. It's a small country between India and Myanmar, and that's where this tragedy unfolded. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about this. I think that this is the biggest humanitarian crisis at this moment. In 2017, August, there was ethnic cleansing started in Myanmar, and there was 900,000 Rohingya refugees crossed the border in search of safe shelter in Bangladesh. The scale and the speed of this influx was such, you can imagine about, say, hundreds of thousands of people crossing the border in a short span of time. So absolutely no way any planning, forget about NBS, could be implemented. But within that, how this has been, unpacked, and some of the good lessons coming out in terms of how you plan and how conservation can be part of the humanitarian response. That's the story I'll tell you in next 2 minutes. Is the picture in the bottom, you see the Rohingya camp established within a forest patch. Just to put you in context, I have seen the small maps, you can see that February 2017, this was an old Kutupalong camp, which was a small, the red dots is the camp area, and the blue line is the impact area. September 2007, fast forward, you see the camp size increasing, and within few months in February 2018, it's exploded. It is the biggest humanitarian crisis. It's also triggered a huge environmental crisis. Next slide, please. And the crisis included, of course, huge deforestation, immediate, can you please go to the next slide? And immediately, the risk of landslides, food shortage. Of course, humanitarian organization did a marvelous, including Bangladesh government, did a marvelous job in terms of immediate response, and they are rehabilitated. However, the area, when I first went there, I was traumatized. I'm not from a humanitarian organization. I work in the conservation. So when I first saw the picture on your left, top left, that was the situation. A place devoid of any blade of grass, complete denuded, complete deforested. But with the proper planning of 15 organizations, humanitarian organizations, including UNHCR, IOM, FAO, IUCN involved in terms of planting guideline, and we started planting. And this is the scenario on your right side in July this year. You can see the transformation. So within that huge humanitarian crisis, in environmental crisis, transformation could be possible. And besides the plantation, the UNHCR and IOM started giving LPG to stop deforestation, to stop the pressure on the surrounding forest. We did a study, we found an 80% drop on firewood collection just because of LPG. So it's a combination of green and gray, and which is, I think, one of the essence of NBS. It's also about scale. The plantation was done at the scale of the whole camp. But just to put you in context, on the map you see on the bottom left is the red dot is the camp, and you can see the green circles, which are the protected area. The camp established within the 3 protected area. And one of the consequences of the establishment of the camp was the elephant international corridor between Bangladesh and Myanmar got trapped, got blocked, and 40 elephants is now being trapped as a huge elephant-human conflict was going on. When we started our work, by that time, 15 people was dead between the August 2017 and February 2018. But due to our interventions, if you see the middle picture, it's the power of the people. We trained the Rohingya community, the refugees, and you can see they're handling how safely guiding the elephant back to the forest, saving life and saving of the elephants. So that's another element, governance, people's power. And the last point I would like to say, sometimes ignored, is the cultural attributes. They are here for some time, and they will go back to their country, hopefully at some point. In the meantime, we need to preserve their culture, because there's that knowledge, traditional knowledge of disaster risk reduction, knowledge of living in harmony with nature. All are the essence of adaptive management, all of the essence of NBS. So in the humanitarian crisis situation, these are the issues we can scale up, and it can be done. I would say the NBS was not present, but now there is a more focus of making this humanitarian operation and scale up this lessons learned and apply this NBS principles. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rakib, for that case study. I'd like to pass on now to Mr. Chet Tamang, who is Program Director for the Managing Risk Through Economic Development, MRED 2 program at Mercy Corps. Chet, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to share a case from Nepal. Can you go to next? If you don't know where Nepal is, it's just next to on northern part of India. Yeah, next please. So you can see on the right a different color overlaid in a satellite image, which represents the location of river at different time in history. And if you measure the shift on the ground, it is even up to 1 kilometer. And this river shifting happens with every flood event. Many people have lost their life and livelihoods. And agriculture is the primary source of livelihood for people living along those river banks in the south, in the uh, west part of Nepal. And during a flood event, either the river erodes the agricultural land or deposits sand and silt, making it no more suitable for normal agriculture activity. So with the loss of livelihood options, male member of the household are forced to leave home in search of work, leaving behind their spouse, kids, and elderly people who are even more vulnerable to disasters. Hence, there was a need of approach and technologies that could prevent the loss of land and also revive the soil productivity, so that the male member of family can stay and protect their family. When you see the pictures, there are also white parts in it, and all those are agriculture land covered by sand and silt. So building on the Mercy Corps learning and best practices from community-based disaster risk management and market system development work, we promoted interventions that can simultaneously mitigate the flood impact, but also generate income. We call it a Nexus approach, also a nature-based solutions. To give you an example, as you see in the picture on the left, we promoted low-cost river protection measures using locally available bamboos, together with the plantation on the river bank that to prevent the river cutting problem. But the river cutting problem wasn't possible to control unless the speed of flood could control. Hence, we promoted plantation of sugarcane on the land next to the river bank. Those were covered by sand and silt. The sugarcane slowed the river current and also was effective to capture productive soil transported from the upstream of the river. The river shifting problem has now decreased, and this techniques has also transferred the soil texture, making it suitable for other crops. People in the area are now continuing sugarcane plantation, but also using land for other crops. Next. Next slide. So implementing MRED program, what we have learned till date is that the nature-based solutions are sustainable. It is low cost. It utilizes the low cost, locally available material. It's easy to adapt and also easy to maintain. And when these solutions are promoted in partnership with government and private sectors, vulnerable households and communities will have access to the resource to continue beyond the program as well. But it takes time as it requires comprehensive assessments to understand the interaction of human and nature, and also to understand the incentive of different partners to engage in. And for every dollars program have invested, we have been able to leverage $4 from government, private sector, and also contribution from community. By the end of the program, phase 2 of our program, we've seen more than 1,000 hectares of land has been conserved and also converted into land suitable for agriculture. 85% of MRED program households were confident in their ability to face future flood disaster. And also 90% of program participants did not have to adopt any negative coping strategy after a disaster event. And we have achieved this result by taking a system approach to address the problem. And system approach in Mercy Corps also promotes an integrated approach and working with at a different level, whether it's a national, subnationals, and also at a community level. And if we are promoting nature-based solutions, then we also have to consider nature as a boundary for our program implementation. For us, watershed is a boundary when we were defining our target area, which also help us to understand the connections between the upstream and the downstream. And it is also equally important to ensure that our program is reaching and addressing the need of most vulnerable, which requires a deeper understanding of gender and social inclusion dynamics and their interaction with nature. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chet, for that interesting example from Nepal. I'd like to hand over now to our last case study speaker, Mr. Justin Colvard, who is Country Director with Mercy Corps in Haiti. Justin, I think you're still on mute.
Oops. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me now? I'm
Yep,
going to
that's
take us 14,000 miles away from South Asia, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Caribbean. My name's Justin. I'm the country director for Mercy Corps in Haiti. And we're going to talk about our Vitae Énergie program, which means life, land, and energy. Next slide, please. So when we look at Haiti, we're looking at a multi-hazard scenario within a chronic and cyclical humanitarian context. Hurricane season comes every year, and we also have some of these chronic food insecurity issues, chronic income generating issues, as well as socioeconomic issues throughout the country. So in 2010, we had a massive earthquake. We have these seasonal tropical storms. In 2016, we had a Category 5 hurricane, Hurricane Matthew. And then we also faced cyclical droughts, flooding, landslides, deforestation. Our Vitae Énergie program focused on watersheds. And so it's important to talk about what are the effects of these cyclical crises on the watershed. In the lower part of the watershed, we have river sedimentation, erosion of fertile cropland near riverbanks. In the higher part of the watershed, we have declining crop yields, soil erosion, extreme deforestation, and diminishing springs. What does this mean for us as a humanitarian organization? There's rising food insecurity, unstable incomes. So Mercy Corps decided to take a watershed approach, working in 28 microcatchment basins that form a microcatchment area of 3 main rivers just north of Port-au-Prince. This is about 4,000 hectares of farmland. We tried to model and layer different approaches across the spectrum of development and humanitarian interventions. One of the first things that we did was a detailed landscape analysis that enabled us to set a long-term strategy for sustainable land management and agroforestry, including biodiversity, introducing new species into the watershed to stabilize the soil and increase productivity. We also spent a lot of time working on governance support for agricultural cooperatives, supporting them to better mobilize their members and work toward land access issues for their members. Third, we worked with the private sector to promote financial products and services that would help farmers to better access resources to improve their land. Mercy Corps actually implemented a conditional credit product that requires farmer cooperatives to invest in conservation practices first. And once we've proven that they've invested in those conservation practices, they then have access to agricultural credit that's adapted to the harvest cycle. The last thing that I think is really interesting about this program was our technology-empowered early warning system. As technology has improved over the years, this program started in 2011. We have been able to layer on different technology solutions to support some of the face-to-face work we're doing. We have an interactive voice response early warning system that allows low literacy populations to have access to information during hurricane season. As far as learning, I think that we've learned that we can leverage technology when it makes outcomes more effective or efficient, but we shouldn't neglect face-to-face approaches. It's really a combination of the two. We layering multiple technical interventions on each other whether it's development or humanitarian, has really contributed to the success in terms of food security outcomes. And also don't neglect the civil society and the governance and land access issues. That's been really important to supporting the farmers to have access to the resources that they can improve their land with. In terms of big successes, we've seen increase in production and more stable year-to-year economic stability. We've seen successful piloting of our credit product. It's economically viable. And then we've also seen a stability of revenue with moderate improvements in food security. As far as recommendations, I mean, back to what Chet said, I think it's important to invest in design processes from the get-go, building out our understanding and modeling, which will change over the course of time, of course, but it's essential to really get that technical design right from the beginning. And then in multi-hazard scenarios, I think the layered interventions has been really useful for us to think about what different types of programs could be layered on top of each other to support that watershed. The last one is seek opportunities to combine technology with personal face-to-face approaches when it can contribute to program outcomes. So I will pass back over to the facilitator. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Justin, for that great example from Haiti as well. So first, I'd like to thank all of our case study speakers, Rakib, Chet, and Justin, for doing such a great job. And I'll hand over now to Veronica, who's going to take us through some question and answers and some discussion. So as we've said before, if you have questions, including questions for our panelists, please feel free to put them into the Q&A box.
Thank you, Charlotte. So now that we have heard from real case studies, what is something that is missing, like when we talk about nature-based solutions, what is this? I need to see a real case. So thank you so much for all the three, and also to Charlotte. But now let's go into the meat. We would like to hear from you now. It was to be a participatory webinar, so we want to hear from you, and we want you responding to the question that you have here on the screen. But before leaving the front to any of you, I would like to put on the spot Emilia. Emilia, you have experience on humanitarian action. So I would like to know from you about the second question, about what are the challenges that you are facing? What are the barriers you face as a humanitarian actor in using nature-based solutions?
Yeah, I think thanks for the question. I think there's a lot of things that already came up. People were talking about the regulatory environment, about the financing, and the different timeframes that we will work on as humanitarians versus development actors. So I think that's why it's interesting and very encouraging to hear the examples that we just heard. And I think that some of the organizations that already have a strong development approach and are used to working with communities are kind of one step ahead on this because they already have that ingrained in their architecture and in their DNA, working with locals and working on a more long-term basis. So I think, but that's one of the key challenges, I think, the financing and the short-sightedness of some of the humanitarian interventions.
Definitely, sometimes, yes, financing and also going into the ground. Well, I see that nobody is raising their hands, maybe because you are too shy, but I can see from the participant that they may have some key people. Yes, we have one hand. So Jamie Richardson, please.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think one thing that I'd be interested in is what your sense is of kind of donor appetite for this approach, because that's going to be kind of fairly critical for us to be able to propose these things, or the sensitization that we need to do with our donor community to allow us to kind of explore this approach.
Yeah, I cannot agree more with you. This is something that we have been trying to work quite a lot with donors, and then this is kind of a change in the mindset, like say, like now we have to work together. We are seeing with what we are facing with COVID and all these humanitarian crises. This is time to really break the silos and go hand by hand and work together. Thank you so much, Jamie. This is something that we keep discussing. well, we have like a group of shy participants today, but okay.
I think,
Jessie. Yeah, Jessie, please, go ahead.
Great, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, really just, I think there's a few things I would mention here. And first, just to say that I come from an organization that is not humanitarian, but we work more on climate change adaptation. But nevertheless, I think some of the points that were raised here resonate within the adaptation space as well. The first, of course, being timescales. And I think the timescales is on two fronts. One is, as was mentioned, kind of the short-sighted funding and approaches. And I think that's an issue that that is evolving, but still remains. But linked to that is also the timescales of the actual nature-based solutions to really kind of take shape. One of the most typical examples, of course, is mangroves and how they pay triple dividends, et cetera. But of course, those mangrove, restoration projects need time to actually mature. So I think that's one of the issues. Another very linked is also the value that's assigned to nature-based solutions. And this is a value that can be seen from institutional donors, national governments, even communities themselves. Although I would say that communities are much more likely to see the value of investing in time and energy into nature-based solutions. And maybe just the last point that I would throw out here in terms of the challenges, and I'm not sure, and I'd be curious to hear about it in the humanitarian sector, but is while there's a lot of talk of the importance of systems thinking and systems approaches, I still think that many times people aren't really taking that approach, and nature-based solutions and the headway it's made in the recent years is certainly a sign that people are moving more towards systems approaches because they understand how nature's linked to society and to the economics. But I wonder there, and it's really a question, I guess, about how much systems thinking comes into responses in the humanitarian sector and in humanitarian operations.
This is a good question, maybe that Emilia, you can ask later, of if we don't have time. Obviously, we will respond to all your questions, and then we will circulate with all of you and with all participants that were not able to join. But I would like to come back to Justin to give a couple of words on terms of the donors question, and then we will come back to participant. I have two hands, so Natalie does well, and then Toril, you will go after Justin.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to Jamie's question as well as what Jessie mentioned. I think that, Mercy Corps is a humanitarian actor. That being said, we've been working in these watersheds since 2011. And a lot of our funding has been captured from USAID, what is now, BHA. And I think that, there are mechanisms to integrate DRR into humanitarian programs. And that's created sort of a patchwork approach for us where, from year to year, we're thinking about what's the next step. And then also how do we communicate the importance of the DRR work and the potential emergency response that can be layered on top of some of this longer term system change to the donor, because I think that the donors do see the need for that, increasingly so over the past 10 years. They've gotten more interest in looking in a systems way across multi-year humanitarian programs, especially for chronic humanitarian contexts. That's all.
Thank you so much, Justin, for the detailed response. So Natalie, can you please unmute your microphone? No?
Sorry, I was trying to find the microphone on my phone. Thank you, Veronica. So yeah, I'm working at UNEP, and thinking about your second question about some of the challenges and barriers about using more nature-based solutions in the humanitarian sector. I remember going to a meeting from UNDRR, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and trying to also increase uptake in reducing disaster risk in a humanitarian context. And I was there as the environmental person. So it was always me saying, and the environment and nature-based solutions. And I think something that really struck me is that the sense I got for lots of people from the humanitarian people working there is that, you know, they may see the environment as as not the most important thing, because they've been working already for years and years, and there are still human rights violations. There are still a lot of what they may consider much more pressing issues. Now, I'm saying what they consider, right? And so there may be a feeling that the environment is just, you know, that's an add-on. Okay, great if we can improve the environment at the same time. So there may be still a lot more education also needed in terms of the fact that this can, obviously it doesn't solve many of the problems that they're working on, and that those still require, but also that, you know, if we're trying to add to the well-being in terms of using nature-based solutions, and we're not trying to compete in those, you know, and working in some of the issues that they have concerns with, but as we saw in some of these case studies, it can really improve the environment and improve a lot of the people's lives in those contexts. So I think there may be already some more, you know, reducing fears in the humanitarian sector, or seeing the environment as a second place, but that it goes hand in hand with all the other work that they're doing. So that's just some of my thoughts on this.
Thank you, Natalie, for your response. And I have to say there is a really good question, and then we are wrapping up. I'm really so sorry that we didn't have the time to respond to all your questions. There is one question related about what is nature-based solutions bringing? That is bringing something new. As I did mention during my presentation, nature-based solutions have been implemented for decades, for years, for centuries. Not indigenous peoples have been implementing already nature-based solutions, but it's not new. What are we trying is like to stop giving different levels and working together under the same family. But especially it's because what I say, we have to make sure that when we are implementing nature-based solutions, we are not we are ensuring that it's not just another way for nature and people to be exploited. It's not just for to say like, this is a nature-based solution and I can get funding. No, we really need to make clear that we cannot promote the use of nature-based solution just for the sake of receiving funding. Is to make sure that we are all on the same page. And this is an approach that has been, as I said, being implemented for decades. And I would like to come back to Nora Toril. You raised your hand, please. I don't want to let you without giving your comment, please.
Thank you. And a bit sort of commenting back. So I'm with the Norwegian Refugee Council, and just coming a bit back to some of the questions. Thank you so much for this webinar. It's been really, really interesting. And I just wanted, because there were several questions going out to humanitarian actors, so I just wanted to give some reflections from how we see it. I mean, nature-based solutions, I think I'm getting a bit, whether it's currently in use, I'm getting a bit of mixed signals from our organization. So I wouldn't claim to have the full overview. I hear some of our livelihoods and food security people saying that, you know, as you were just mentioning, that this is, you know, old news in new wrapping, as they would say, put it, but it's not something that we do systematically. And same things with moving more towards systems thinking. That I really see that our innovation people are really pushing for this to be a more sort of systematic approach in the way that we operate. So we have a lot to improve on that. We're currently in a bit of I would say a bit of an exploration phase to decide where we put the emphasis in a more sort of environmentally aware programs. So this is one of the options that we will be looking at improving. And also on sort of what's preventing us from doing it. I think Emilia pointed to very good points in terms of funding and in terms of timing, but it's also something about competing demands. Like I see it with us, we're trying to work in hard to reach areas. We're trying to improve our protection response. Like for the people in the field, this changing to a more sort of new types of programming also requires new skill sets that for NRC at least we don't already have in the organization.
Yeah, thank you so much, Doris. Was also what Justin was saying. We have to work more in a systematic approach. We need to think about like why in a more holistic approach and consider all the different components of the landscape and or the seascape. We need to think about all of this and what are the impacts. We need to stop focusing at the project basis and more thinking about a landscape approach. That's why it's very important the design at the scale and to engage with different communities like humanitarian, conservation, of course, and other communities. I would love to say like 2 days or 3 days, keep talking about nature-based solution and humanitarian sector and environmental sector, how we can work together. So if you are interested in keep having this discussion, I will really invite you to be part of the working group on humanitarian actions that is part of the Friends of Ecosystem-Based Adaptation Partnership. You can please be in touch with my colleague, Emily Godwin. She's coordinating FIBA from the IUCN Secretariat. And over to you, Emilia, for the takeaway messages.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the speakers today and to all the panelists and to all the attendees for engaging. I have found it really interesting to kind of get beyond the words and actually start moving into the meanings and activities. What do we mean when we talk about nature-based solutions? So I think this is a really good place to start at, and I think we've definitely been provided with some food for thought and also some potential things that we can take forward on how to work better between ourselves, but also with donors. Also from the JU EHA network side, I mean, we're very keen to continue to hear from you. So we're going to collect all of these questions, and we'll reach out to all of the attendees here with the recording as well of the webinar, and send those links to the networks where you can be in touch to get more information. I would also encourage you to please share best case studies and best practices with us, because I find that the more we talk about these good things that are happening, the more they become common practice, and the more we can then influence each other and influence donors as well, and move towards better humanitarian programming. With that, I'm thanking you again for your participation today, and hope to hear from you very soon. Thank you to everyone, and have a good day, evening, morning, whatever. Thank you.